morning, everyone, and welcome to this FedSoc Forum webinar titled DOGE Unleashed, Trump Executive Orders and Their Impact on Telecommunications Regulation. My name is Libby Dickinson, and I'm an Assistant Director with the Federalist Society's practice groups. As a reminder, all opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not of the Federalist Society. In the interest of time, I'll introduce today's moderator, who will then introduce our panel. But if you'd like to know more about any of our speakers today, you can access their full impressive bios at fedsoc.org. That is fedsoc.org. And to that point, our moderator today is Slate Herman, Legislative Counsel at Wilkinson, Barker, Knauer, and who previously served as counsel for the House Energy and Commerce Committee, representing the interests of Chairwoman Kathy McMorris Rodgers on the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, where he oversaw wireline and satellite communication policy and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Prior to Capitol Hill, Slate worked as an attorney advisor at NTIA's Office of the Chief Counsel. One last note throughout the panel, if you have any questions for our speakers that pertain to the topic at hand, please submit them through Zoom's Q&A feature, not the chat, so that we'll be able to access them when we get towards the close of our webinar. And with that, I will hand things over to our moderator to start things off. Slate, thank you so much for joining us today and for moderating this excellent panel.
Awesome. Libby, thank you so much for handing it over, and I will have the pleasure now to introduce our wonderful panelists one by one here. We'll start with Ms. Austin Bonner, who is a partner at Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis, and she leads the AI and Emerging Technologies Practice Group and is a member of the Telecom and Appellate Practices. Before returning to private practice, Austin served in the White House as Special Assistant to the President on the National Economic Council and as Deputy U.S. CTO. She was also acting Chief of Staff and a legal advisor to Commissioner Jeffrey Starks at the FCC. Welcome, Ms. Bonner. Next, we have Mr. Scott Delacourt, who's the Chief of Staff of the Federal Communications Commission. In this role, he manages the chairman's policy agenda and strategic initiatives and serves as the Chief Operating Officer for the agency. Scott joined the FCC from Wiley Ryan LLP, where he served as a partner and chair of the Wireless Practice Group. He previously served in leadership positions at the FCC, including Deputy Bureau Chief and Chief of Staff of the Wireless Bureau, Senior Counsel in the Office of General Counsel, and Legal Advisor to the Wireless Bureau Chief. Welcome, Mr. Delacourt. Next, we have Ms. Brooke Donilon, who is the Chief of Staff for the U.S. Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Prior to NTIA, Brooke was the Vice President of Government Relations for NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. She also served as Chief of Staff to Commissioner Michael O'Rielly at the Federal Communications Commission and Deputy Chief of Staff to Senator Ron Johnson and Chief Counsel for the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Donilon. Next, we have Professor Roger Nober. He assumed his role as director of the George Washington, or GW Regulatory Studies Center and professor of practice at the Trachtenberg School in January 2024. His career includes service as Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer at BNSF Railway, Chairman of the U.S. Surface Transportation Board, and Chief Counsel of the Committee to Transportation and Information of the U.S. House of Representatives. Prior to joining BNSF, Nober was a partner in the Washington office of Steptoe and Johnson LLP. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today, and we'll get started with some questions. Professor Nober, I'd like to head to you first to kind of lay the ground for us in our discussion. In today's conversation, we'll be talking about a few key Trump administration executive orders and their impact on telecom regulation, specifically at the FCC and the NTIA. I was hoping you could start by giving us a lay of the land in terms of the main executive orders we will be talking about in today's discussion.
Well, Slate, thank you very much, and I appreciate that invitation. Back when I was a kid growing up in northern New England, I used to get called Nober because it was French Canadian. But so it's been a while since I've heard that, so I appreciate that. So thank you for having me, and I apologize for being a minute late with the Zoom link. It has been an incredibly active time in executive orders and changing the landscape for normal regulatory action. And the principal ones I'd like to focus on, some of them are the obvious, which is the administration came in and had a 10-for-1 executive order that said that for every new rule that goes out, 10 have to go away, and that's on the heels of the last Trump administration had a 2-for-1, so they've upped it by 5. So that's one one that's out there. The second, I think, really notable one has been the change with the executive order with respect to independent agencies, because the Federal Communications Commission is an independent agency, where this administration has tried to make several changes to the way that multi-member independent agencies created by Congress operate. That's sort of separate from the legal challenge to whether or not the president has the power to hire and fire a confirmed commissioner who would otherwise only be able to be let go for cause, who's been confirmed by the Senate for a term of years. But the executive order did a number of things. First, it subjected major rules by each of the independent agencies to OMB review, which would mean that they would go to OIRA and be reviewed for cost-benefit analysis and have to go through some analytic rigor. And while that's certainly a change, that is not a partisan issue per se, since having major rules from independent agencies go to OMB and be reviewed by OIRA has something that's been considered by both Democratic and Republican administrations. And, as a former independent agency head, I may have a personal view on that, but that's certainly not outside the bounds of what we've seen, what has been considered in the past, especially considering the magnitude of some of the independent agency rules we've seen. Then it also has a number of constraints on the chairman, and in most independent agencies, chairmen are designated by the president. And so those include performance reviews, budgetary reviews, having a White House liaison, and we can debate what those are, what the impact of those would be. And then the final executive order I wanted to mention has been the one that directed agencies to review rules that may be in conflict with their statutory authorizations and to determine whether they would, and it listed 10 Supreme Court cases, which I won't review, and said if it conflicts with any of those, they should notify the Attorney General and the President, and they would therefore declare them to be invalid and do so without the normal notice and comment process you would go through. And sort of typically in administrative law, you have to undo a government action, you have to follow the same process you use to institute it in the first place. And so there's just been a remarkable number of changes that have gone on. And, in addition to that, this administration has taken some actions that are sort of geared toward legal challenges. It's changed the definition of and the status of many civil service workers. It's brought DOGE in, and DOGE has made changes at many administrative agencies, and it's challenged the ability of Congress to be able to confirm people that can only be removed for cause. And Humphrey's executor, which I confess as a 40-year lawyer, I didn't know anything about Humphrey's executor until a few months ago. So with that, I will turn it over. That's an outline of the incredible activity we've had on the executive order front in the last 3 months.
That's a perfect base level for us to start our conversation with, and you can't have a panel that says DOGE unleashed without kind of starting there. So I would like to start with the conversation about DOGE, which was one of President Trump's first actions in office, and I'd like to go to Scott and Brooke on this one. And I would like to know how you've seen the DOGE EO implemented in your specific agencies, whether at the Department of Commerce broadly, or at the NTIA specifically, or at the FCC specifically, and kind of talk a little bit about your relationship with the DOGE team leader and what are kind of some of the results you've seen at your specific agencies.
So why don't I start off there? Slate, thanks for having me, and thanks to the Federalist Society for putting this on. I appreciate it. The DOGE EO required a number of things. Some of them are establishing a DOGE team, as you alluded to, contract oversight, freezing micro purchases and card usage, tracking non-essential travel, real property inventory, workforce items. So there's a lot to it. And we've endeavored to do all those things to comply with the executive order. But I'll just start with what I think was really one of the most significant parts of it. And that was reviewing all of the agency's contracts and the procurement process to identify efficiencies. And we did that as sort of a first order of business. And it was a really intensive and long process, took a couple of months, reviewing all of the agency's contracts in areas like the real estate portfolio, to consultants, to periodicals and legal journals. But by and far and away, the biggest area of contracting in terms of number of contracts and size of contracts was the IT area. And so we really focused there. And as a result of our review, we were able to eliminate or modify contracts, saving $6.7 million in 2025, and then $21.1 million for next year, 2026, which is about 20% of the agency's overall contract spend. So it's pretty significant. And that's just looking at obligated funds. If you go by another measure, which is essentially authority to spend, or what we call the ceiling on a contract, we eliminate a lot more spending authority. It gets into the weeds quickly on government procurement, but we reduced the ceiling on contracts totaling $567 million over a number of years. So this was a big project and not one we would have likely undertaken absent the executive order. So I think that was productive activity. In terms of coordination, we did set up an internal DOGE team and worked with the small DOGE landing team from the executive branch. It was a cordial and productive activity. They were very helpful, and we appreciated their involvement. They got involved on IT contracting, personnel issues, and the delete regulatory proceeding. And it was really a value add.
I'll just chime in, echoing Scott. Contracts has been a big thing that NTIA has looked at, eliminating where we can, cutting significantly back when needed. I think a big question is looking at these with fresh eyes and asking why do we need this? And a lot of the times we did not get great answers. So really trying to make the contracts work for NTIA and not the other way around. We've also done a really thorough look on grants. And I know, Slate, you'll want to talk about BEAD later on, so I'll save that for later. But, big picture, NTIA is not a regulatory body, but we are looking for ways to implement these EOs, and we are approaching what we do have oversight of, largely grants, with that same deregulatory approach that I think these EOs are pushing.
Great. And kind of turning over to Austin and Professor Nober, you both spent time within the government and now find yourselves on the private sector side of the equation. From an external perspective, how do you view DOGE and this administration's approach to, kind of fighting against waste, fraud, and abuse and looking for efficiencies?
Roger, do you want to go first?
It's either one, but I would say that those who deal with the federal government fairly extensively, might say that some behavior change in the federal government from the workforce is probably a good thing. And that, anybody who's tried to work with agencies, because of the structure of agencies and just the sort of nature of a large organizations like the government, it can be very slow, it can be very frustrating. And the second thing I think was raised by both Brooke and Scott is that, government agencies don't do a zero-based budgeting review the way you would, that I did in the private sector, where you start from scratch and say, what do we need? What do we not need? You typically roll things over, and there are incentives to do that. So, from my perspective, some of the core goals of DOGE may have been very, very valid. Now, we could all have probably an extensive debate about how some of their, some of the actions that they took, and certainly how they were portrayed in the media and how effective those have been. But I think that agencies being and the government workforce being subject to some accountability, more accountability is that there may be the core of a very good thing there.
Well, I'll just add, I don't think there's anything wrong with the kind of fresh eyes on contracts that Scott and Brooke have described. And it also sounds like the experience of these two agencies is not totally consistent with other agencies like USAID or the U.S. Institute of Peace, where the operation worked really differently. My source of concern and maybe my source of skepticism for now about the effort is that really making sure that every dollar of programs that were meant to serve the American people is an incredibly important effort, and one that takes some expertise and a deep understanding of those programs. Designing protections against waste, fraud, and abuse in our programs isn't a one-size-fit-all operation, although there are tools that we can use again and again. I think it's worth asking whether there's a true partnership with the people who really run those programs, and whether the people who are implementing them across the federal enterprise who are thinking about these kinds of cuts actually know the programs well enough that they're cutting. One of my, I think, most important parts of my career, it was an honor of a lifetime to work on the COVID era programs, ACP, the Emergency Connectivity Fund, and others that really serve people at a really hard time for our country, and protecting those programs is incredibly important. Having someone who didn't really know anything about USAC come in and give instructions to the FCC staff would have been really damaging at that time. And I think might have directed us away from the real problems. We know that there are lots of different tools that you can use, and you got to make sure the tool fits the kind of problem you actually anticipate, and make sure that the tool is worth using. So consider me skeptical for now, and we'll continue to monitor.
And I'll just briefly chime in on that, just with the experience of NTIA. Whenever there's been a question of a cut, we have been consulted, and our opinion has been not only, asked for, but abided by. So I cannot, again, speak to the experiences of the other agencies, but we definitely have that collaboration at NTIA.
Yeah, I would add, to the extent we did cutting at the FCC, I mean, we identified the cuts. I mean, the DOGE cuts weren't identified for us. We identified those cuts. So it was people who are very familiar with the programs and the agency's operations.
Great. You both kind of used the keyword in my next question here, but two of the biggest DOGE related cuts, or DOGE-esque pushes in the field of telecom regulations are the FCC's delete proceeding and the NTIA's recent changes to the BEAD program. Scott, let's start with you. I feel like a delete-esque proceeding has been something on the chairman's mind for a long time, probably even before he became a commissioner originally. How has this administration's priorities enabled Chairman Carr to pursue this delete agenda?
Yeah, I don't think it's a surprise that Chairman Carr is receptive to the administration's deregulatory agenda. It's something he's been talking about for a long time. And the delete proceeding was one of our earliest initiatives, and we've had a big response. There's a giant record that came in response to our public notice in that proceeding, and we've got a couple of initiatives underway to deal with it. The first of those is a bottom-up review of all of the FCC rule parts. We've assigned the different quarters of the agency, each one a rule part to look at and identify rules that are no longer needed because for a variety of reasons, they're either not required by the statute, or impose more burden than they generate benefit, or speak to a technology transition that's over, or a technology that no longer exists, all these types of things. And, that part of the process is, I think, relatively easy. It's labor intensive, but there aren't huge constituencies to maintain rules that apply to technologies that no longer exist, for example. Then the other piece of that is what came into the record, where industry stakeholders identify rules that are pain points for them. That gets a little bit trickier because there are equities on both sides of that. I mean, one person's unduly burdensome rule is something that someone else sees some benefit in, or maybe a lot of benefit in. And so we've that requires a little more thought. And what we're going through now is trying to separate those two buckets and use faster processes for the ones that essentially are non-controversial, where that first bucket I alluded to, where it's technologies don't exist anymore, for example, and we'll try and deal with those in short form regulatory processes. For our next agenda meeting, we've got something called a direct final rule that's up for consideration, where you go immediately, you eliminate the rules immediately without the need of an NPRM. See if processes like that may have some value. In other cases, we will use traditional APA rulemaking. We'll go to NPRM, and those will be longer form processes. But we want to be efficient about how we're approaching it and not overdo the process where on matters where there's not a significant constituency for keeping rules.
Great. Let's head to Brooke. Next, the NTIA recently announced a significant rule change for the BEAD program. We were talking a little bit in the lobby kind of pre-panel about how DOGE is both a noun, a verb, an adjective, whatever you want it to be. So how are these changes kind of driven by the DOGE mindset? And do you believe the program will still achieve its goals that it was set out to achieve in the beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just give a little bit of background for those not familiar with the BEAD program. It was established in the infrastructure law in 2021, a $42.5 billion broadband deployment program. And then unfortunately for 3 years, nothing, no shovels got into the ground, no broadband was deployed. And that was for two reasons. First, the past administration bogged it down with process. And second, they bogged it down with extra legal requirements that had nothing to do with deploying broadband. And so when Secretary Lutnick got over to the Department of Commerce, he called for a review of this grant program specifically. And we issued a policy notice outlining the results of that review on June 6th. First, we're eliminating a lot of the process, a lot of the back and forth between the state and NTIA is eliminated. We were giving very strict orders to get these updated final proposals in from states within 90 days, and that we must review and accept or approve within 90 days following getting the application. So that is a significant decrease in the timeline. In fact, for 46 states, their final proposals are now due sooner than they were prior to our updated guidance. So eliminating the process, I think, is really important. We're still working very closely with the states and territories. We're cranking out FAQs on a weekly basis to make sure they understand what the rules are and how to get this program done as quickly as possible. And then the other thing we did was we just stripped out all the extra legal requirements that the Biden administration put on the program that was outside the bounds of the law, usually was debated in Congress and rejected, and really just added time, expense, confusion to the program. So those are extra labor requirements beyond what was in the law, climate change mandates, net neutrality, open access requirements, extensive local coordination and DEI stakeholder engagement, preferences for non-traditional broadband providers such as government-owned networks, and then rate regulation, which of course was directly prohibited by the law, but pursued by the previous NTIA, both through a very confusing, bureaucratic, middle-class affordability requirement, and then backdoor rate regulation in the low-cost service option. So we cleaned all of that up. We streamlined the process. We're really proud of our policy notice. Monday was a huge milestone for us. All 56 states and territories met their first deadline of July 7th, submitting their corrected initial proposals, putting them in line to follow the updated policy notice on time. I mean, do we expect all 56 states and territories to come in on September 4th? Probably not, but we expect a very good number of them. And we're really excited. Our secretary has testified twice now, I believe, that he hopes to get all the money out the door this year. That would be a huge endeavor. We're very hopeful that we can accomplish that. And I think if states can meet their deadlines, we're committed to make ours.
Great. Austin, I want to go to you next. You served as the Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer for Policy during the Biden administration, and then also at the FCC. What were some lessons you learned about how best to drive agency policy from the White House?
You know, this is such a good and interesting question. I think the biggest lesson for me, even having spent time at the FCC, is that the White House changes how you look at risk across the federal enterprise. So one of the projects that I spent a lot of my time on was on national security and emergency preparedness communications. So the systems that make sure that even on our very worst days as a country, we can keep talking to each other and keep performing our national essential functions, the things that we promise the American people that no matter what, we will do. And that, I think, teaches two lessons. One is that anytime you're thinking about streamlining and downsizing, there's a lot of that can be done, having still a mind toward resiliency. I think we've got at least one former head of PSHSB on the line with us. We do sometimes maintain redundant systems in the federal government so that we are 100% sure that on a very bad day, those systems are going to work and will work under different kinds of threats. The other thing that it taught me is that having fresh, new voices come in at the political every political level every 4 years, every 8 years is energizing, and can bring a lot to the table. But my job in the White House would have been impossible without long-term career civil servants who knew down to the switches and wires how to run those systems. Those people are incredibly important. They have hard jobs. We don't pay them as much as they would make in the private sector. And so treating them as a valuable resource that's essential to getting those essential functions done is a big part of the job. And instilling that from the White House on down, I think is one of the things that I'll take with me through the rest of my career.
Well, and I'll follow up on that a little bit. I think something you said at the beginning that was very interesting is the cross coordination across, you're at the White House, you're looking at the 30,000-foot view of everything. And so what was it like having to go from, kind of the 30,000-foot view from the White House down to the very technical level of the wires and switches? And how is that like going back and forth from those kind of things in between meetings, having to explain the White House initiatives to the career staff and then kind of coming back with, hey, here's what the career staff is saying to the White House? What was that process like?
I think that takes a little bit of technical acumen, a lot of people skills, and a willingness to listen and go back and forth a lot. Those are thankfully things that I think the FCC has always valued in its teams, and are easy to apply across the federal enterprise. There's different kinds of skills in the federal workforce, and so being able to take sort of facts on the ground situations from people who are operationally running systems, and then be able to translate that into policy is a good reason why, even though I found the number of meetings we had kind of exhausting, you got to keep talking to people.
Gotcha. Thank you. Let's move on here. Professor Nober, at the outset of the second Trump administration, we saw an executive order that fundamentally changed the regulatory landscape in this country. Can you talk a bit about the ensuring accountability for all agencies executive order and how this changes the regulation at independent or formerly independent agencies?
Sure. The typically independent multi-member agencies have a legal independence, and they are the kind of the sort of trade-off that Congress created is that you would have multiple members, usually an odd number of either part of bipartisan of both parties, and they would serve for terms of years, and those would be staggered over time. And so you might have a majority of the other party as soon as you take over, but by the end of your 4-year term, you'll have had a majority of yours, and that may sort of carry over into the future. And the idea is that even though you don't have, the White House does not have direct does not have direct policy authority over them. The fact that it's bipartisan and the fact that the president can designate the chairman in most of those agencies would, and generally speaking, agency chairmen try to bring the policy perspective of the president who's appointed them. That changed significantly at the beginning of the administration with the executive order that we talked about at the beginning. And the main features of it were to subject significant rulemaking to OMB review, which had previously not been. Now, if we look back at sort of the most controversial regulatory actions of the past decade, several of them were done by independent agencies, the SEC and the FCC, like net neutrality, or the Federal Trade Commission. So the non-compete rules. So there are really some significant economy-wide rules that have been done by independent agencies, and having those subject to OMB review is not a uniquely Republican view. That's one that's been bipartisan and shared by many. It's really more about philosophy of government than it is about partisan Republican versus Democrat partisanship. Then it has a number of other provisions which are very carefully written that are coercive and binding on the chair who is appointed at the pleasure of the president, that talk about that the budgets have to be reviewed, that the agency can't take a legal position that is contrary to the legal view of the president and the attorney general. And independent litigating authority is something that Congress debated extensively when it created agencies, that I did when I was the lead House staffer creating an agency. It provides for performance reviews by OMB of the chair. And they're very careful not to make them binding on the agency or direct the agency to do anything, just saying that the chair has to do these things. And you could argue that the chair has to do them anyway, because the president could just let them go if they didn't, on the one hand. On the other hand, typically agency counsel will tell you that to maintain independence, you can't have direct policy control. And I think this administration is openly trying to create that concern, create that issue, and see how the courts rule on it. And it's one that is we'll have to see how the courts ultimately do. But it is a significant change, particularly for some of the major policies at the FCC. It would have been net neutrality. At the SEC, it would have been climate disclosure rules, and we can go through the independent agencies with those.
Gotcha. Thank you. Well, and kind of as a follow-up to that, for my current FCC practitioners, my current FCC staff, and former FCC staff, how do you think this changes the way that advocates approach advocacy at the FCC and other independent agencies, and kind of what benefits and drawbacks do you see for the advocacy realm when we kind of question this idea of the independence of the FCC? So Scott, I don't know if you want to start and then go, maybe Brooke and then Austin.
Sure. Well, I think if you take a step back, so you've got an EO that is addressed to having the FCC act more like an executive agency, and then it requires certain actions. And what's it really getting at? Well, it's trying to ensure policy coordination. It's trying to ensure a couple of things, that the FCC's actions align with the needs and priorities of other federal agencies. That's one. And then they also align with the administration. And I don't think it will be a surprise to people who practice in this space that that type of coordination has always gone on. And, we do it extensively. We coordinate even before this executive order through NTIA and through the on spectrum matters, through the IRAC process. And also, on IRAC, the other federal agencies sit and have a say. But we do it also in a bilateral way with agencies that have significant equities in a particular proceeding. So, for example, on the C-band proceeding, we consult extensively with the Department of Transportation and the FAA. On the FCC's national security agenda, we work closely with the national security agencies. So in terms of how that impacts advocates and folks who want to influence the process, again, people have always tried to influence the FCC process or proceedings that are before the FCC through venues other than the FCC. So that could be influencing the process by activity on the Hill, before NTIA, for the other federal agencies directly. Parties can go to the White House, and they do all these things. It's not, they didn't start doing them or won't start doing them as a result of this EO. They've always done those things. But I should note it's difficult. Those intergovernmental processes are not as open and transparent as what the APA requires in a rulemaking that the FCC conducts. An APA rulemaking has a measure of transparency and certain defined opportunities to participate where an advocate's views have to be taken into account. So I think, filing comments and conducting ex parte meetings before the FCC will still remain the principal way of influencing outcomes at the FCC, but there's always the ability to pursue advocacy before other agencies.
Yeah, I would just agree with Scott. I don't really view this as a major change from the NTIA perspective. We are, as the principal advisor on communications policy, will continue to weigh in with the FCC on behalf of the executive branch. We've done so in a number of proceedings already this year, including on submarine cables, alternative PNT solutions, and advanced air mobility. We've been part of the IRAC process when it comes to upper C-band. And obviously with the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill, NTA has a very big role to play on advising the FCC on how to free up government spectrum for commercial use. So we anticipate very active engagement on the spectrum front with the FCC. So, I guess it remains to be seen, but right now we are very much business as usual. And we think NTIA has a very important role with collecting the expert views of the interagency and relaying those in a public way to the FCC.
I guess I agree with Scott and Brooke that there are already lots of really solid interagency coordination procedures in place. And I also think that this new world is going to be different and is going to feel different to outside practitioners. All of those forums, from IRAC to the MOU between FCC and NTIA to a wide variety of sort of policy councils that the FCC has long participated in, were all structured in a way to protect the FCC's decision-making and to protect the independence of the FCC's decision-making. And that's sort of explicitly like what the executive order is changing. And I think that those will take a long time. We've had these procedures for a long time. Our understanding of the interplay of how the FCC works in relationship to the NTIA Act that says that NTIA is the president's principal advisor on these questions have existed for a long time. And it's going to take a long time for those assumptions and procedures to change. But what the executive order is asking for is change. I also think we have this great bar around FCC world where so many people who are practicing in front of the FCC spent time at the agency, really familiar with the procedures and processes. So we benefit a lot from those efficiencies and relationships. OMB is a different world. It has different rules, different stakeholders, different traditions, and often because of the way OMB interacts with the interagency, ends up drawing in different people into a decision than the FCC normally would. I think that outside advocates, it's sort of time to get much more familiar with those processes and procedures. But there are great people there. There's great expertise in that process, but it'll be new for a lot of people.
I would just say that I think that if you look at the order, and again, this is going to be the lawyer in me now coming out, it nowhere gives the White House the ability to direct the agency to vote a certain way. It says the chairman can't take certain positions, that are contrary. The chairman can't advocate for them. And it says that your rules have to go to OMB for review. So OMB could veto something, but again, it doesn't direct. OMB doesn't have the power to direct the FCC or any independent agency to vote to adopt a rule or reject it for that matter. And so I think the people who wrote it, they obviously intended what Austin suggested. That's the goal, but it was written very carefully to avoid calling the question of, can the White House directly order an independent agency with multi-member to take a certain position without a vote?
Gotcha.
I just throw that out there. And I also think that for significant, I mean, I agree that the independent agencies in general will always be the principal place because they're the agency of expertise and jurisdiction for matters. But speaking to other constituents in government has long been a government relations staple of adjacencies, including the White House.
Great. Well, we'll take a brief pause here just to say for those audience members participating, if you'd like to use the chat function to insert your questions. I don't think we have the Q&A function enabled on the Zoom call, but if you want to use the chat function, I will read through the questions, and if we have time, we'll ask our panelists your question. So moving on here, discussing DOGE and EOs and kind of their impacts on future efforts. Scott, one of the effects of the Ensuring Accountability for All Agencies executive order is that future FCC regulations go through this EO 12866 regulatory review that takes place at OMB and OIRA. How has this affected the way the FCC pursues new rules, and how has this affected the timelines for new rules?
So the EO has impacted us by requiring some additional process. As has been alluded to, when we are preparing rules, we now have to run things through the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, at OMB, and solicit their views. Through that process, it gets the item is reviewed by the various executive agencies. But it's not every item. So to be submitted to that process, it has to, a particular action by the FCC has to hit a couple of triggers. One, it has to be a regulatory action, meaning involving the proposal of rules or the adoption of rules. It wouldn't apply to an adjudication, for example, or a declaratory ruling. And it also has to be significant, meaning having an economic impact of $100 million or greater. And if an item doesn't meet those two triggers, then it's business as usual. It doesn't go to OIRA at all. If it does, then it goes to OIRA for review and to ensure alignment with the views of other government agencies and the administration. So how that affects our process is really a timing matter. If we need to hit a particular date, say a commission meeting, but we have to build in time for that review and we have to front load it. But again, I would say this isn't hugely new. This is a new process, but having to do things like that for the FCC as an agency is not new. We have to do all manner of things when we prepare an order, including reg flex review, cost benefit analysis, paperwork reduction act. So we, have sort of a process management to ensure that those things get done and that we can still hit our timing bogeys. It's additional bureaucracy, but we're a regulatory agency, so we build that in. We're bureaucrats. That's kind of what we do.
So how has this changed your interaction with other executive branch agencies who now have a potentially much earlier formal bite at the apple than they used to?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think it's much of a change. As I alluded to before, the agencies already get a bite at the apple, and I would even phrase it a little differently. It's like we give them a bite at the apple. They are our partners in the process, so it's not like they're coming at us, and reluctantly they get a bite at the apple. I mean, this is part of the process. Before the EO was adopted, we coordinated extensively with NTIA through the IRAC process, and there were other avenues for coordination. We coordinate through the National Economic Council, the National Security Council. We continue to do that, and we often coordinate with state governments as well. The EO formalizes a particular coordination, and that is this OIRA process that I've alluded to. But even there, we've had formal processes before. The IRAC process, for example, is a very formal one. There's a memorandum of understanding with NTIA about how that occurs, and it's governed with timing deadlines and process, and it's all very familiar to us.
Kind of heading from there to the executive branch, Brooke, one of NTIA's roles is acting as the kind of the liaison between the executive branch and the FCC by filing on behalf of the executive branch. How do you think these EOs have changed NTIA's role in that process, and how will NTIA pursue that role going forward?
Yeah, I think similar to what I just said, so far we haven't really seen a change. I guess it remains to be seen. But for now, again, we really are the voice of the federal users on spectrum, and we are really gearing up for extensive collaboration with the FCC on how to deliver on the vision Congress just sent to the president. The president just signed into law on when it comes to federal users in particular, making 500 megahertz of spectrum available for commercial use. So on the federal user side. So that is, again, business as usual. And we see a lot of coordination in our future, but we've also had a lot of coordination up until now.
Gotcha.
Okay. Just pose a practical question, which is, independent agencies before this executive order would routinely receive comments from other branches of government, right, on their proposals, their rules. And that was standard. And I don't know how frequently chairmen would ignore, for example, if NTIA wrote a comment on behalf of the administration opposing an FCC proposal, that a chairman would continue with it regardless. So as a practical matter, is it that it's a change in process, as Scott said, but is it a change in substance?
Long-running disagreements between NTIA and FCC on spectrum matters in particular are not uncommon in our history.
But would they ignore that?
Scott, you want to answer that?
I was going to pose the question to you two. Anyway, what do you think are the largest legal hurdles and potential pitfalls that this administration will face as it attempts to regulate the field of telecom in a new way?
Do you want me to start, or who do you want to start?
Yeah, you can start.
I would say that a fundamental issue will be the process that they follow to make changes. Kind of as I said earlier, a sort of fundamental precept of administrative law is you undo or change a government action in the same process you followed to do it, to institute it. And I think for those that want to see lasting policy changes will, some of the changes to eliminate public comment, to short circuit what would have been normal administrative process, will those be lasting? At my old agency, which is not telecommunications, two of the signature rules of the prior chairman, who we really wanted to see go forward and ignored process, have both been overturned by the courts and are now, have undone years of process. And if that's the case, then what will have been accomplished? So if you want, the question is, will lasting change, will the changes that DOGE has made in terms of staffing and process changes be able to produce lasting regulatory changes?
Austin?
On a similar vein, I think you do, even when it comes to executive orders, sort of manage what you're measuring. And so when I read the 10-to-1 item, one of the things I thought was, how are you going to both, as a White House, manage people meeting the goal that you've set out for them, while also making sure those 10 things are important or high value are not just 10 things to make the thing that you're measuring. Administrations, can feel long, and they are very, very short, and you have to be ruthless about your priorities. And it makes a lot of sense to try, even, at this early stage, to look and say, what, even of the many, many instructions the White House is going to be providing, what is going to be the most impactful on the American people, and making sure every day you focus on that, because the time flies.
Yeah. It kind of in a follow-up to that, do you think this new regulatory formula will persist through future administrations, and what impact do you think that has on regulatory stability, kind of for Austin and the professor as well?
I think a lot is going to happen in the next few years, and it's very hard to know what's going to be stable and not stable. And the courts are going to have a lot to say about that, where we don't know the answers yet. But I'll just say, whoever takes the baton, the short time clock will run on them too, right? And so you do start with what you inherited and have to work from there, and the short time you've got. So it certainly matters.
I mean, I would say that the biggest shoe to drop with independent agencies is going to be this challenge to the ability of the president to just terminate commissioners at will. And if that does happen, what will be the impact on independent agencies? They'll just, how will that change work? And the other thing to remember about lasting changes is they have to be durable, and you have to remember, how are they going to work both ways, right? So there's going to be a Democrat elected president. Sure, absolutely, positively. And that Democratic president is going to see these opportunities and be able to remake agencies much more quickly, and maybe undo things. So anything, again, coming back to the fundamental principle that you change a government action by the same process you followed to make it. If these change, you have to be careful. Are these going to be lasting changes, or are we going to begin to start to see the wide swings in the independent agencies that we see in the cabinet agencies, or the executive-led agencies? I always call them cabinet agencies, but that will be the question, and it's to be determined. And there's really a lot of open. We're in a new world on that. The independent multi-member commission has been a staple for 100 years. And this would be the most significant change since the 1930s, when these were all created.
I see we're running a little low on time here, so kind of one final question for all of our panelists, just to wrap it up, and then I'll turn it over to Libby from FedSoc to wrap us up. What has been industry's response to DOGE / kind of deregulatory efforts? Have they been supportive, cautious, skeptical, and are there any specific regulatory rollbacks that industry stakeholders are particularly excited or concerned by? Scott, if you want to start us off.
Sure. I think people have been very supportive and excited about the deregulation that we're doing, particularly the delete proceeding. Chairman Carr recently announced what he calls the build agenda, which is an effort to advance economic growth and enable deployment of communications networks. And deregulation is a huge part of that. It's something we're excited about advancing, and advancing that build agenda through deregulation. So, that would include infrastructure reform, which, includes permitting reform and eliminating obstacles to network deployment, simplifying and reducing the costs of getting access to utility poles, reducing and expediting environmental reviews and historic preservation reviews. And then you've got, the space economy and commercialization of space, where we will be streamlining and reducing the cost of securing authorization to launch large numbers of satellites, and also streamlining and reducing the cost of deploying receive equipment. And then, you got the universal service area, where, as Brooke has been talking about, Congress and NTIA reducing the conditions on the use of BEAD funds to deploy broadband networks to rural and underserved areas. So, deregulation is going to be bigger than the build agenda, but that's one area that we're really excited about.
Brooke, why don't you go?
Yeah, I mean, again, NTIA is not a regulatory body, so I think the best example I can give is our review of the grant programs, BEAD and, particular. I think industry was very happy to see us lift the extra legal requirements that the Biden administration put on the BEAD program. Maybe a mixed bag on changes to the technology fiber preference from the last administration to restoring it to a technology neutral approach that Congress set forth and that the previous administration ignored. I think there's been a lot of angst and questions on how will this what will this mean for states that have already closed out? We've already moved forward and we're ready to go. And, we've talked a lot with states, we've talked a lot with industry, done a ton of FAQs on the topic. I think we've gotten people a lot more comfortable. We've actually had some states already run a round of the benefit of the bargain round. And again, we're really excited about the progress that we're seeing with the states and making this very collaborative. So I think all in all, we have gotten a lot of positive feedback, and our number one goal is just for BEAD to work. I mean, Austin talks about what you can do to help the American public. I think the biggest thing NTIA can do, or one of the biggest things NTIA can do, is close the digital divide with the huge opportunity Congress gave us with the infrastructure law. And so that is what we're focused on, is making this program successful. And that will be, I think, a big cornerstone of what NTIA does under this administration.
Awesome. Roger, you want to go next?
I mean, as I said, I think that the long-term question is going to be what are the lasting changes and deregulatory changes that come out of these efforts, and will they be durable, or will this be much like in the last administration, many changes that went into place and then a new administration came in and they just undid them on day one and went in their own place. So we see this sort of regulatory whiplash. And one of the things that a lot of us have been hoping for with the Supreme Court decisions and some of the changes that we've seen in the regulatory front has been to end regulatory whiplash. And will these changes just exacerbate it? That's an unknown question going forward.
And Austin.
Well, I think my response is very similar to Roger's. And of course, as with all my answers, I'm not speaking for any of my clients here, but what I hear people saying they want is certainty. And particularly to know that even if they get the change that they want from the regulator, that it's going to last in court, and that requires some procedural care and some attention to those downstream consequences. So regulatory certainty seems to be the main thing I'm hearing.
Awesome. Well, on behalf of the Federalist Society, Telecommunications, and Electronic Media Practice Group, I just want to sincerely thank you all for taking the time today to have this conversation and in a thoughtful and engaging discussion. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Libby.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to our speakers for joining us today and for sharing your insights. And thank you to Slate for moderating. Thank you also to our audience for tuning in today. We apologize for the Q&A function not working today, but we still had a fantastic discussion here, very informative, so we thank you all. If you're interested in learning more about all of our programming here at the Federalist Society, please visit our website at fedsoc.org, as I mentioned earlier, or feel free to send us your feedback. We always love to hear it at fedsocforums@fedsoc.org. Thank you.